Hi, I'm Dave Webster and I'm sat here today at the University of Gloucester with Peter Conan from Marling School in Stroud, and we've been talking about Buddhism in lots of respects. Now I want to talk with you for a few minutes about the textual traditions in Buddhism, what is sometimes referred to in the Theravada tradition as the Pali Canon, and we've got some examples of it that we'll talk about as we go on. The Pali Canon, the language being Pali, is often referred to as the Tipitaka or Tripitaka, the three baskets. What are these three collections?
Okay, Matthew Megalopras, to quote him and his great little overview of the text, begins with the Vinaya Pitaka. This reflects, he says, the early life of the Buddhist community. The Buddha needed every 2 weeks to recite the rules of the Buddhist monastery, and these rules were recited and recited. At the death of the Buddha, perhaps there were several schools developed, but these rules developed into lots of different schools until eventually this set of codified rules for monks and nuns was written down. So that's the Vinaya Pitaka. Interesting little quote here. He calls it a quality control system. Apparently there were some monks who didn't behave too well, and so he needed to ensure and give them rules that they would behave well as part of the Buddhist community. So that's the Vinaya Pitaka.
I think anybody who's lived with anybody else at all, the students who might have lived together, will realise that actually people need some kind of order, and lots of people living together in that particular way needed it's a very structured way of life, and it is very rule bound. If people look at the Patimokkha, this full set of these rules, they might be quite interested in finding out some more details about what it would mean to live together in big communities like that in a very ordered, structured and effective way.
And perhaps before we go on, we could just think critically about this. There are a lot of rules, but there seem to be a lot of rules that are for women and not so many that are for men. For a religion that's perhaps really interested in desire, that this seems, and sensual, the problem of sensual desire, this seems to have perhaps been, well, some people have accused it of being sexist. What would you say to that, David?
Clearly, the early Buddhist communities that developed these rules are dominated by men. Yeah. No question of that. So, and they're dominated in a deeply patriarchal historical period, even more than now. And so there's a deeply patriarchal period where rules are developed by men, largely on presumptions about men and women. And so men are protected from women in that sense.
And some of the rules are very strange.
Oh, absolutely. And some of them persist today in Buddhist communities, so that a woman giving a donation to a male monk, he has to cover his hands, make sure no physical contact, because she's somehow responsible for his level of desire. And that we find that kind of that thinking in almost all world religions at some stage. And I think this idea that men are incapable or not responsible for the way that women make them respond. So you do find that, and so there's very clear evidence that early Buddhist communities had a negative view of women, and you find that in the rules, and you might find it in the Jataka stories of the Buddha's previous lives as well. So there's numerous points where that comes up.
And maybe in a further video we'll look at
Absolutely.
problem of sexism in Buddhism. Now moving on, the second of the three baskets, the Sutta Pitaka, is perhaps the better read section. It includes some great bits, the Dhammapada, the great collection of little book of wisdom that probably everybody's got a little copy of on their coffee table. It's got a code for lay people, so ethics, not just for monks and nuns, but for lay people. The Jataka tales, great just so stories for children. And it's got advice, suttas that advice on meditation and mindfulness, and lots more beside. This collection of sermons and of sayings, short, medium, and long, perhaps one of the most difficult aspects we can think about this is the idea of the Buddha, the life of the Buddha. We don't really have a gospel of the Buddha. There's no gospel of the Buddha included in this section. Why is that, David, do you think? Why do we not have a clear account, a chronology, a life of the Buddha there?
What seems to dominate the concerns of the Sutta Pitaka is what the Buddha said. Yes. And almost every kind of piece opens with, thus have I heard. Yeah.
The Blessed One says, yes.
And it's recounting normally by Ananda, of something he's heard the Buddha recount, a story. So the words of the Buddha, what the Buddha had to say, is what really matters. Now, to a scholar, what's often interesting,
What's that called? The word of the Buddha.
the Buddha Vachana, the kind of the kind of words of the Buddha, and these really kind of matter, and it's the kind of message. What's more interesting for a scholar often is the little bit around it, where it says, in this place at this time, the Buddha went and he did this, and then this happened, and often those details are more interesting than all the content. But as you rightly say, the Sutta Pitaka is a more read section because it involves the Buddha giving sermons, and it's like all Buddhist things in more structure and lists beyond those three. There are lots more divisions underneath them, such as the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length sayings, which are translated into English, and are, at least compared to some of the literature we might talk about in a minute, fairly readable, and most of the incidents that people have heard of from the life of the Buddha are recounted within them.
Yes, great. The last section, the advanced, or the Abhidhamma, the advanced teaching collection or basket, Pitta. Now, how could we possibly summarize this in a few minutes? It's full of really challenging and really difficult teaching about consciousness, nature of reality, deep questions, but not everybody reads it. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the highlights for you of that particular text, and what are some of the critical questions we can ask about it?
So the Abhidhamma rightly means kind of Abhi, the kind of higher, further Dharma or teachings, is a collection of texts, and it wasn't the same for every tradition as they emerged. They developed their own Abhidhamma traditions, but it was people taking the material that was in the suttas and trying to make it abstract, codify it. So some Abhidhamma editions have big fold-out.
So it is a kind of philosophy of...
It's the philosophy, but it's absolutely non-narrative. So it's almost like all the ideas that are here stripped of all narrative colour, stripped of all context and personal aspects, and made into a very philosophical schema. So it attempts to categorise all the different aspects of consciousness, and then categorise them according to various...
There's a sort of psychology of Buddhism.
It is, absolutely, and some people have referred to it as being the first consistent, cohesive world psychology. It tries to say, how do people work? And I remember listening to the author of this book, Introduction to Buddhism, Peter Harvey, talk about Abhidhamma when I was a student. And I was saying it's really boring. But he made us read this, it's really boring. And his response was, no, this is a user's manual. A user's manual to a piece of equipment is boring, but it's a user's manual to the mind. Yes. It tells you how to take it apart and put it back together so that it works better and doesn't make you so miserable. And I think that idea that it's a schema where you look at, why am I having so much anger? These are the factors that are causing the arising of anger. This is what can be done about them. So it's very methodical, it's very structured, it can be exceptionally difficult to read, and it's very likely that you find lay Buddhists having anything to do with it. They won't be familiar more with the Sutta aspects of, or collected tales from the Sutta Pitaka. The Abhidhamma is more of interest to monastic Buddhists, or certain monastic Buddhists, and scholars who love stuff like that, as you can imagine.
Yes, great. Now, before we get on to the historical critical questions, the psychology aspect of the Abhidhamma, some have criticised it in saying it leads to people who are perhaps have psychological problems. Is it a good psychology? Does it marry with contemporary psychology? What do you think about the end product of reading that and practicing it?
Contemporary psychology is quite a diverse church, as it were, and so there are aspects of the Buddhist Abhidhamma vision you find echoed in some aspects, but there are very significant differences. For one thing, according to the Buddhist version of it, nobody is mentally healthy. We also have very substantial difficulties, and we all need treatment probably quite quickly because we're all doing things wrong.
It's a bit Freudian, that, yeah.
So there are kind of echoes. When you read it as with a psychological lens on, it starts setting off certain flags in that response. However, if you see, it depends how you read it. Some people have read it and said, well, this seems to be basically suppression. Yes. But other Buddhist writers responded to this critique and said, actually, it's not about suppressing sexual desire, say, it's about exploring its roots. Yes. And working through it in meditation. But it is very different to a contemporary psychological response to it. Although there are those interested in the contemporary mindfulness movement and some within the positive psychology movement who have a lot more interest in the Abhidhamma than many more Lacanian, Freudian psychotherapist approaches.
Fantastic. I do want to look at this question of historical critical studies and the text. So this idea of the word of the Buddha that Megha talks about, Buddha Vachara, to what extent can we read, or would Buddhists read the text as a divine revelation, or to what extent is it something else?
I think divine revelation is very fixed in our head from being brought up, I think, at least both of us, in a divine revelation type model of what religion is. Yeah. So that sense, for many Buddhists at least, would see it not as divine revelation, but as the teachings of this kind of person who, as we said in the previous video, discovered the way, a kind of path maker, discovered this path, and it's him, it's almost like a map. But
some people see it as so the Theravadan tradition, as I understand it, has a very fixed approach to the text. The text has been canonized and established. It's and that's it. It's been done and dusted. But not everybody agrees with that.
No, not far from it. And actually, the approach of canonizing the text and venerating rather than worshipping the text is very widespread. But also, it's very diverse. So the Mahayana traditions, in what they refer to rather evocatively as the second turning of the Dharma wheel, the Buddha's the first. He sets it in motion. The second, have an outpouring of new sutras, the perfection of wisdom literature. And they see these are much more like something divine because they have been revealed by the Buddha but concealed somehow till the time when people can understand them. And so you get an outpouring of literature that kind of doesn't stop, really. So there's this idea of almost like a kind of theistic notion of ongoing revelation, but something about literature not being closed off but in a process of ongoing development, which is very different.
And if I could just hang on just for a sec, authority. The question of authority is really important. In Tibetan thought, authority is not held primarily by the text, but with perhaps the tradition of lamas. How is authority, as you understand it, important? How is it carried out across different traditions?
And what you'll find is that varies. So if you look at some forms of Zen Buddhism, you find that there is a lineage tradition in the same way you were talking about in relation to Tibet. So if you studied with somebody who's patriarchs and traditions, and you studied with a kind of master, and you pass it in small group teaching from master to pupil in this respect. You'll find in the Theravada tradition the idea of there is meant to be a kind of canon, but there is also a monastic authority of various sorts. But then you find in some Japanese and Chinese forms of Buddhism the idea that a text has a specific text. So you'll find a school of thought centered around a particular text, and they almost seem to worship that sutra, because there's the Lotus Sutra, more than the idea of the Buddha themselves, and they become fixated on the primacy of that text.
Thank you. I think that's all we got time for. Thank you very much.
Okay, pleasure.